Hello everyone, it is time for another recitation. Here we're going to be doing React Router XKCD. So last week we spent our time recreating XKCD.com in React by making use of their REST API, but now what I'd really like to do is replicate some of the routing that the site has. You know, here we have some starter code that I've modified a bit from last week, and we'll walk through that, but as we go in between these comics, right, we see them sequentially, but the URL doesn't change. And if we go to xkcd.com, we have this comic URL here. And we showed last week this isn't entirely necessary, right? We can hold in React state which comic we're looking at and figure out which one to go to, you know, next, previous, latest, first, but a lot of our browser ecosystem is built around the idea of routing and not just our React state changing, right? I can't bookmark this specific comic. I can't bookmark a React state variable as much as I wish I could. And also I can't use my back and forward buttons to navigate, even though it feels like what I'm doing here is some type of navigation. And so what we want is we want a way to add that type of routing, the different URLs here, into a React application. However, we have a bit of a hurdle, which is normally, right, when I click on a link here, what we're actually doing, right, is our page is going to refresh, and we're going to send a request to a web server. It's going to give us a whole bunch of HTML. It's going to come back into our web browser, and that's what we're going to see here. In React, we have a single page application, which means if I pop into this public folder here, see this index.html, this is actually the index.html that our React app lives in, plus the whole boatload of JavaScript that we make. And so we don't want users actually navigating around our website. But we still want to react to those roots. So how do we do that? Well, taking a look in source here, we have our project already set up for us. I moved the comic component into its own file for the first time. We're going to have components in different files. But if we take a look in app.js, what I'm doing is I'm just rendering this comic. I have some placeholder components here too. So what I would want to do, right, is when we're at, let's say, /about, right, what I would want is for this to show this about component that I have, this about page. Same with blag. So if I'm familiar with my JavaScript APIs, I would know that there is a window object, and this window object has a key called location. And location is, again, an object that has different things on it, mainly path name. And path name is going to be this value here after the URL, the path that we're on. And so, if I were clever, which I'm not, I could use this kind of shortcutting style if that I used last week in order to react to different values and then return a different component, the same way we did with the loading state. So I could say if window dot location dot path name is equal to about, right, /about, then what I want to do is I want to return my about component. And we're going to see, once our page refreshes, that that has worked perfectly, right? We don't even need React Router. We can add another route if we want. Let's have a route called something, and we'll just render a div right here that says, I am very smart, right? And now I can see, I can type in something, and boom, that works perfectly, right? So why do we need React Router? Why do we need this additional tooling in order to have routing on our single page application? Well, if you notice, when I type in about and hit enter, the page goes white for a second. And that's because when a browser does navigation, right, it doesn't know about the whole React, JavaScript, SPA ecosystem. It assumes that when I enter this new URL in, that it has to go talk to a server, get a bunch of HTML, and show me that. If I were to just change this URL, without actually requesting the whole React application again, we can see what happens. Right, so I'm going to do that with another JavaScript API. It's called window.history, which gives me access to my browser's history. And I am going to just replace our current URL. I'm not going to explain the syntax of this command because it's not super important, but instead of about, I want to go to /something. Right? And when I hit enter, we notice that we're now at /something, but the contents of our page haven't changed. And the reason is because we've taken for granted why React is good, right? And that's because the way React works, right, is we hold state either at the top of one of our components or at, some component above where we are. And whenever that state changes, React re-renders our application by rerunning all of these functions, getting the new value it outputs, and then putting that onto the screen for us, right? What's actually happened here is the value of window.location.pathname has changed, right? It's changed from about to something, but React doesn't know that that's happened because that value has mutated, right? It's just changed. It's not stored in React state. We didn't use a set state function to tell React, hey, I want you to render again, but this time with this value. So React doesn't know how to do that. And just by virtue of typing in that different URL and hitting enter and reloading our entire React application, we were able to accomplish that. But that's not what we want here. So what React Router does is allows us to put the value in our URL bar into state and then react to it as it changes, right? Instead of using this kind of mutation. So that's what React Router's for. So the way we do this is I've already installed the package React Router DOM. If we look at our package.json, we have React Router and React Router DOM. React Router DOM is going to be the thing that we're using because we're in a web browser. So I'm going to go to my index.js. This is what we call the root of our React application. This is the top level. This is where we actually grab the DOM node that we can see in our index.html. Right here, this empty div with the ID of root, that's where a React application actually lives. So when we do things like add routing, this is traditionally where we put it. So I'm going to import a component called a browser router from React Router DOM. And I'm also going to rename this. You don't have to, but everyone always does, even though you only ever use it once. I don't know. I'm just going to do it out of convention so you recognize it when you see it. We're just going to call this router instead of browser router. And then I'm going to wrap my app in this. Right? So we have our router around our app. And what this is going to do, we can just kind of accept as magic at this point. You don't really have to understand the mechanism here, but I'll mention it briefly for those of you that do know, and for those of you that don't worry. Router is actually a context provider. Normally in React, we pass all of our data through props, right? That's how we get data from a parent to a child component. React also has this backdoor method of getting data around called context. And what it allows us to do is we can have a parent component that we call a provider that has some data in it. And then we can use a special method anywhere below it in our React application where we can access that data without using props. This is really cool for those of you that are annoyed by props. And this has been in React for a while, but we honestly didn't see it being used very often because it's pretty cumbersome to use. It's very verbose and complicated to actually hook up a component to context and then just give those context values via prompts. So we weren't accomplishing very much. So it was largely used by library makers like React Router. But now we actually have access to some of those context internals thanks to React hooks in a super ergonomic way. We're going to explore that a bit later. But for now, Router is just the magic glue that lets us react to our path changing in React. So now I'm going to go into app.js, and I'm going to comment out my hacky solution for routing here. But I want to do a very similar thing, right? I want to be able to react to the path name, right, and show different components. And the way we do this is very Reacty, right? If statements, that's JavaScript. I'm writing React. I want to write JSX. So I'm going to do this by importing a component called route from React router DOM. And what route is going to do is I can render it like any other component, but I specify a path. What this is going to do is when we're at /about, for example, I can render some stuff. I can give it a component that I want it to render, like about. And now, whenever our path matches /about, we're going to see our about page show up. So let's comment these out real fast. Let's save this. And let's pop on over to /about. Boom, there we go. There's our about page. Well, you'll notice that our comic is still showing up, right? And the reason because is this isn't like our if statement in that it doesn't return and shortcut our component. It's just saying when we're on /about, right, when the path matches here, render my about component. So I'm going to do a similar thing to our comic, right? Same deal, but for now I'm going to put it under /comic. Right? And so now they won't both show up at the same time. We can even do this another way, right? Where I render a route, I'm going to say the path is /blag, which is the XKCD blog. And we're going to give it to it as children, right? Just like we would with a div, we'd put components inside of it, right? We call that children in React, and this will work essentially the exact same way. There's going to be a difference here. We'll talk about that later, but if I go to /about, I see about. If I go to /blag, I'm going to see that. And same thing with our comic. So now we've got some basic routing going. But ideally, right, I'd like to be able to click and move in between these. It's the whole point here. So we're at /blag, and before we do that, I'm just going to stop real quick and see if we have any questions so far. Anyone have any questions with where we're at? All right, cool. So I'm going to add a link, right, the way that I normally do with an anchor tag, with an A tag here. And this is going to link to our about page. I'm going to give this link an href, and this is going to go to /about. We're going to see what that looks like here, and it's going to look pretty terrible because we have a near black background. Luckily, I have some CSS prepared for us, so I'm going to come here, just change this Nav Link selector to get all of our A tags. Boom, there we go. Right, and I can click on this, and this will take me to the About page, and that works as soon as this is done rendering, which is really taking a while. And now this works, right? But we saw with that very extended white flash that that's using the normal browser method for the way a link works. When I click on that link, the browser thinks it needs to go and talk to our server to get some HTML to put it on the page. Right? What it doesn't think is that it just needs to replace the value in its URL, and the whole website will take care of it on its own. So what we're going to do is we're going to use another component that React Router DOM provides for us. That's called link. Right? And works basically the exact same as an href. Right? It's a link. Text is going to be about here. Instead of an href, we're going to use a prop called to. right? Which is just a slightly better name for this. What does href even stand for? Well, it's hyperlink reference. That's meaningless to me. So I like 2 a little bit better. Right, and so let's go back to our Blag page. And we're going to see both of these rendered onto the page with even the exact same styling, right? Because if we look in our DOM, these are both A tags, right? This link is still an A tag. However, the second one, our React router link, has an event listener. We can actually see what this does after the React stuff has been compiled down to normal JavaScript. And we can see what it does is it calls event.preventDefault, which is going to prevent the default behavior of clicking on this link. And then it's going to go and do some other stuff. I don't know. Doesn't matter. But essentially what this is going to do is when I click on this, right, instead of actually refreshing the whole page, it's just going to change that value in my URL. And because we have that router provider around our app, that's going to know to re-render app and let it know that the route has changed, and we're able to see those differences without ever leaving this page. Now, we truly have a single page application with routing. That's pretty cool. So, I'm just going to write a quick nav component, right, with some of our different links in here. We're going to have our about, we're going to have Blag, and let's get our comic in here too. All right, we're going to have all 3 of these at the top, and I can click around, right? We can go to the different pages here, and that all works just fine. There's even another special component that React Router provides to us called Nav Link, which is identical to Link, but allows us to set specific styles on it when we're on that same page, which is really cool. In the pre-React world, getting a header that's the same on every page, except the link that you're on is highlighted, was actually super annoying and a very common cause of visual bugs because that wasn't generalized correctly. But we get that essentially for free here. I'm going to leave that up to you to explore today. So we have this working, right? But if we look over at our XKCD website, we'll note that comic isn't actually on /comic. It's at /this comic number, right? When I click on this link and go to a different comic, we have the different comic number here. So we need some way of representing a dynamic route, right? I need to be able to show different comics when we're at different comic numbers here. In addition, right, we have just at the root level of our application, which I'm going to keep saying without really explaining, but root is what we call this top level slash, right? If we were to draw a tree, right, the roots would be at the top because computer scientists are bad at drawing trees. So whenever I say root, I just mean kind of the top level. And so we can try that here, right? And I can delete comic just so we have this top level slash. And we're going to notice something weird happening as soon as I come over to our about page, which is that we now have both of them, which might seem strange, right? Because we're at about, we're not at this lonely top level slash. And the reason is because by default, the way this route component works is it will do partial matching. It will take the first part of this path, or this entire path rather, and try to match it to the first part of our URL. Right? So it sees /about, that works here. If I do /about/subroute, right, it's still gonna match about. This still falls under the purview of this route and anything inside of it, because this route might render, routes underneath it. We're allowed to nest them like that. So that'll match. However, this top level slash is always going to match because there's always a slash right here. Even when visually it looks like there isn't, there's still effectively one there. So the way that we get it to not work like this, to not perform partial matching, is to add a prop here called exact. And if I give this the value of true, instead of performing partial matching, React Router has to match this path entirely. So when I come over to about, this is no longer going to match here, right? Because it doesn't match the whole thing. I'm going to show you a neat trick real fast, which is that if I have a prop like exact, and I want to give it the value true, I can just not give it a value. And this is literally the same thing as me just saying equals curly braces true, right? This is just a holdover for how attributes actually work in default HTML land. But this is how the cool kids write that, and I want you to be in the know. So that's how we can do this exact matching here. Let's change our comic link to go to just this slash. And now we have that working. Right, we have another tool at our disposal called switch that's very common, because oftentimes it can be annoying to play around with like exact things. Like maybe I actually render, a subroute of about here, and now I have to put an exact on this, and it can be difficult to figure out. So instead, we can use a component that React Router gives us called switch. What switch does is we put some routes inside of it, and it does a really cool thing that I bet you did not know you could do in React, which is that it takes a look at all the children we've given it, all these components that are inside of the switch, and it looks at their value for path, and it figures out the first one that is going to match, and then it renders that one and doesn't do anything else. Right? So if we put this inside of the switch and remove this exact here, we're no longer going to see the comic showing up on every page. And that's because the switch is going to go through here, /blog doesn't match no, /about does match yes. Okay, I'm going to show the about page, and I'm just going to ignore whatever comes after here. Right? That's similar to how a switch statement kind of works in JavaScript. But notice that if I move this path up to the top, right now it's going to be the only thing that ever shows up, because this slash is always going to match. And so this is good for rendering a fallback page, right? Maybe this is still back on /comic. I could use root with a slash here, and maybe this is my 404 page, right? So now, if nothing matches, if we end up where we're not supposed to, we're going to find our 404 page. It's pretty cool. All right. Do we have any questions at this point? Alrighty. So we've got that going for us. Now what we want to do is get this number routing working. For a minute, I'm going to ignore this top level, this root level slash rendering our most recent comic, and I just want to get this working. Right? I want to be able to show this specific comic number. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to look at our React Router documentation. Right? The React Router documentation, it's very good. It can be interesting to navigate sometimes, but it's always a good idea to take a look at our documentation. We're going to look at the web version because that's what we're using. We're going to go here and we're going to scroll down and we're going to find the component we're interested in, which is route. Right? And then we can even find the exact prop that we're looking for, which is our path. And notice path can actually be a string or an array of strings. That's how we write an array of strings here. And they also have this weird thing, right? They have /users/:ID. What this allows us to do is this allows us to specify this value here, this :ID, whatever word we want. And this is called a slug, a URL parameter, bunch of other names you're going to hear for it, but basically it's a placeholder value. right? Whenever I go to /users/1 or 6 or 12, it's going to match that root, and then React is going to give me special access to the value that was here. So I can change this root. Instead of /comic, this is going to be /:comic number. And now, whatever I put after this value here is going to render our comic page, right? I could put, 221. And now it's going to render that comic page because it's matched something here. And now our 404 route doesn't really work, but that was neat while it lasted. Right, so that's what this is. Slug URL parameter. It's a placeholder that React Router is going to fill with whatever ends up in that position. How do we access this? Well, let's take a look at our comic component, which is in this components folder inside of comic.js. Notice that this accepts some props, right? Whenever we're trying to work things out in React, our first step is to console log our props. So we're going to take a look at comic props. We're going to see the value of props here, which is interesting because I haven't given comic any props, right? Let's take a look in our console, and we see some props, right? We see history, location, and let me get out of the way on the recording, match, right? There's also one here, static context. We're going to ignore that. It's not relevant, but we have history, location, and match, right? And history and location are essentially the same as the window.location and the window.history I showed you at the top of the hour, right? Oh, because I planned ahead. I'm a genius. And so location, very similar. We have props.location.pathname, which is going to give us this value here. We also have search, which will give us anything after a question mark. These are called query parameters, right? If you go to google.com, something like that ends up encoding whatever value you've searched for, and that'll end up in props.location.search. It's also hash, which is going to be anything that comes after a hash symbol. Note, all right, this is just a tangent, but I think it's important, especially for programmers, to know that this right here, this symbol is not called a hashtag. Please don't call it a hashtag, right? A hashtag is called a hashtag because there's a hash symbol and then a tag, right? A hash and a tag, right? This symbol is called a hash, not a hashtag. Very important. Not relevant at all. Mainly, we're going to be interested in props.location.pathname, right? We also have history, which is, we're going to do some fun things later, but we have this third new thing called a match, props.match. And we'll notice that inside of props.match, we have a couple values here. We have our current URL. We have the path that this has actually been rendered on, that the route has matched here with our comic number in it. But we have another object, right? Props.match.params. And inside of params, there's a key called comic number, right? That's the thing that I named my slug. Whatever name I put here is going to be the name in this object, and its value is straight out of our URL. So again, this is props.match.params.comic number, right? That's how I get my URL params from React Router. And I don't like writing that. I do not like writing props.match.params.comic number. It's too much stuff. So, a little pro move is to just put it into a variable that's shorter. So now comic number is equal to props.match.params.comic number, and I can just say comic number. Easy, right? I can even destructure this. If I wanted to get fancy, I could say curly braces comic number, is equal to props.match.params. Ooh, spooky. I'm not going to destructure it because we're doing enough new things right now. Okay. So now what I can do is I can take this value and I can use it. So if we look, right, we have our fetch comic function and we have our fetch latest comic function. And we also have our use effect, which I very specifically told with an empty dependency array to only run once, right? Because nothing in this array will ever change. So it's only going to run when our application is first mounted. And we're going to fetch the first comic. Instead, I could say, you know what? I want you to fetch our comic number. And now that we're on comic 221, boom, there's comic 221, which I chose randomly, and it's the random number comic. Incredible. Incredible. I'm a genius. Right? And so I could go to a different comic, let's say 228. No idea what this one's going to be. And it's another great one. So we can get that value out of our URL and then use it as a variable inside of React. Last week I talked a bit about, well, we could save the number of the comic in a state variable and, do use effects based on that. Well, React Router lets us essentially do that, but instead of putting it in a state variable, it manages that for us with that whole match params object. And I can't forget, right? I want to, if I navigate to a different page here, let's say I change my button to be a link. Let's import link from React Router DOM. Right? If I come up here and I'm like, oh, I don't need these buttons anymore, right? I can just make a link that is going to point to the first comic, which would be /1. Right? We're going to mount a page. We're going to get comic 228. I'm going to hit first. Page changes to 1. Comic doesn't change. That's because I did my use effect wrong, right? I need to say whenever the comic number changes, I want to rerun this use effect, which React is even going to tell me about, right? My use effect has a missing dependency, comic number. So whenever my comic number changes, I'm going to need to rerun that use effect. Right? And so now that works. That works great. Do we have any questions at this point? Nothing? We're all router masters here? Okay. So I could go ahead and I could replace these buttons that normally fetched comics on click with links, and that would work. Right? It's going to present a couple issues, which is one, this first button has actually been disabled. Right? When we're on the first comic, there's no reason to click it again, and you can't really disable a link. You can effectively disable one by putting an event.prevent default on its on-click event, right? But that's terrible for accessibility. We could hot swap it out with like a span that doesn't do anything when it's clicked on. That's a very Reacty solution, but also pretty terrible for accessibility. And now you also have to make sure the styles stay the same. Or we can just leave it as a button, which is also a good exercise and why I picked this. But now we need some way to change the route imperatively. I need to be able to do it inside of some code rather than just having a user click on a link. And the way we're going to do that is with this history prop, which, similar to window.history, which I use to change our URL, we can use this history prop we're getting from React Router in order to change the location that we're at by just running some JavaScript. So what I could do is I could come up here, right, and I could say, okay, I have props.history coming in from comic because whenever I, in my app.js, right, whenever I do this special thing, or not, I'm sorry. Oh, this is the right app.js, wrong project though. Whenever I have a route and I give it this comic component, it goes ahead and it gives me those special props, right? Well, I have those in comic. I need to get them down to the comic buttons so I can pass the props down, right? So it has those two. It's a lot of work. I'm a very lazy man. Instead, what I want to do is I just want to get that history object. And because of that hand-wavy conversation we had earlier about context, right? Where if we take a peek inside of index.js, we have this magic router component that actually has location and history and our match inside of it. We can use some special hooks to just get those values wherever we want, right? And that's through the magic of context. Ooh, fancy. So we have 3 hooks. We have use history, we have use location, and we also have use params. There's a use match too, but you almost always just want the params. So these are our 3 big ones: use history, use location, and use params. And you can use these in any component that is underneath this router. So I don't even have to worry about passing history down. I can just say inside of the comic buttons, I want history. Const history is equal to use history. Then I've gotten it. I could do the exact same thing with location as well. And this is going to be the same thing that I would get with props. Exact same thing. And this is what's given rise to this style in app.js, as writing these as children of the route component instead of via this component style. This used to be the only way to get those things, right? This or an HOC, which is terrible. I hate HOCs. Right, but now with hooks, with context, we can just use that to get exactly what we want. I think it's a lot simpler. I think it's a lot more elegant, more friendly to us as developers. So I use it every time. I never do this. I never do route component. I just always use this style now. You don't have to. You can use whichever one you like more. I just really like these hooks. And these are relatively recent, and React Router version 6, which is coming out soon, we're currently on version 5, makes heavy use of the hook interface in order to do neat things like this. So those are the hooks. Any questions with those? I say, giving myself an excuse to drink water.
Question?
Yeah.
It may be a little unrelated to this, but like when I'm working with Redux and I have Axios calls in my actions, and I want to do a props.history.push in the response.
Yeah.
Like I don't have access to history there. How do you work around that?
Yeah. So what you would do is, right, you don't have access to history, and these hooks, right, use history. We can only actually use them inside of React components or other hooks, which have to be used inside of React components or other hooks and eventually a React component. So we can't actually get around that with use history here. I'm sure there's a React middleware, or I'm sorry, a Redux middleware that would let you get access to that. But kind of the more idiomatic approach would be to, instead of triggering a history.push inside of your .then or your .catch, would be to set some value in your Redux store and then have a use effect react to that value changing and then have it perform the history.push. Again, there might be some middleware. I know React Router used to have an integration called React Router Redux that would allow you to dispatch actions that would then change your location as well, or sync your location to your Redux store, and that'll also work. And there's similar things floating around today.
Okay, so for like example, for a sign-in page, so you're saying in the Redux store have something like, I don't know, I actually don't know what you would have
Yeah.
in the Redux store to trigger that use effect.
Yeah, so normally, right, you'd have a couple values here, right? You would have login started, right? You would have login success, then you have login failure, right? If this were my login component, I could just have a use effect that says, right, whenever using my selector, whenever the value of, my login success changes, if login success is true, then history.push to, homepage or whatever. And that's a perfectly fine way of handling that.
Okay. And this would be on the form component.
Yeah, on the form component, somewhere in the login component. This could even be at the root level of the React application, though I wouldn't recommend that. But yeah, this still keeps it very Reacty, right? We're just reacting to this data changing. Maybe right, this is what you would have to do if the response value from the login told you where to go next. Like maybe if you logged in as an admin user, you'd go somewhere different than if you were a regular user, right? So we would need to set that data into our Redux store and then react to it like this anyway. This is just, a Boolean. Did we do it or not? But same concept.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
You're welcome. All right, cool. Great question. Any other questions? All right, cool. Back to our router stuff. So now I have access.
Actually.
Oh, yeah.
Hey. Yeah. I wasn't sure just about the conversation you just guys had. I think I've done that before, and I was just passing props at history to the actions, the Redux actions.
You know what?
Worked.
That actually.
That's not a right way.
No, you can totally do that. Didn't even occur to me because I don't actually use Redux that much. But yeah, you can absolutely do that.
Because we had the exact same. We were using Redux, and then. And I wanted to make sure. That's why I just went back to my project, and yes, that's how I remember too. Okay. So yeah, I was just passing it, so it worked.
Yeah, I don't know. That does work. The only concern would be it's fine here because history itself is mutable, so you're never going to have an outdated reference to the history object. But since we're doing asynchronous code, passing stateful stuff around can sometimes get dicey, but is fine with the actual history object. So yeah, you could do that.
Okay. Thanks.
You're welcome. All right, cool. So now I have this history object, which built up a lot, but history is going to let us change where we are, what our URL is, just with JavaScript. And what I can do is I can say, instead of fetching comic1, I'm going to say history.push. And if we think of the history in our browser as an array full of places we visited, which it is, right, the push method on an array is going to add something to the end. So that's going to be where we currently are. That's the end of this array. So I can just say history push /1. Right, and I'm going to go to some other comic here. Let's say comic 12. 12 seems good to me. And now when I click on this first button, right, not this link that just takes me to 1. When I click on this first button, it's going to take me to 1. And I can even hit the back button and it'll take me back there, right, without doing a full page refresh. That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. Right, there's another reason that we might want to use these history methods. instead of the links, which is very subtle. But let's say I want to actually replace the next button with a link as well. I don't want to use buttons. Right, well then instead of going to /1, I need to go to whatever the previous comic is. Right, and so like any prop, I can give to a dynamic value by just giving, a pair of curly braces and doing some JavaScript. I'm going to use a template string here, and instead I'm going to go to /comic_num -1, right? And this is going to go to our previous value. And, right, this should be good. Wait for it. Boom, error. We got an error. Does anyone know why we got an error? When we're doing the same thing here, right? This is just comic_num -1. I just moved that here into my link. Why are we getting this error? It's because when we try to calculate this value, this button here, cleverly enough, calculates the value comic_num -1 when we click on it, right? When we invoke this callback function, which happens when someone clicks on the button. However, we've chosen to disable the button while the comic is still loading. And while the comic is loading, the value of our comic is actually null, right? We haven't gotten it from the server yet. So we don't know the value of comic.num. We don't know the value of comic until loading has completed. Whereas this link, right, this is not a callback function. This is saying, right now, as soon as this link is rendered, I want you to do comic_num -1. Right? And so that's why we're getting the error. It's because we don't actually know that value yet. Could I replace comic.num with the comic number right out of my my URL parameter? Yes, I could. Couple issues with that. One, we don't actually know if it's always going to be a number, so I need to have some logic to parse it. But two, it's going to break when we actually eventually do the whole root level latest comic thing. So I'm going to stick with these buttons. But still, same concept. I'm going to steal what I've written here and then replace this with a history.push. And paste that right in there. And do we have any questions with that, why we're getting the error there? Okay. Same thing. Next, right, we're going to come increase this, and then on our latest comic, right, we're just going to go to this this top level root. Right, I'm going to get rid of this lonely link hanging out here. All right, so theoretically, next brings us to 13. We can go back. We can navigate using our back and forward buttons, right? And that works. And now I need to figure out this, right? Need to figure out this. When I click on latest, I want to see the latest comic. There's a lot of ways to handle this. Right? I could do something special. I could say, okay, you know what? I have another route, right, that's just going to work on this top level thing, and we're going to have to render comic with some special props, right? Oh, I did this very wrong, right? And we could say, like, some prop first comic, right? I don't know. Notice that also this style, right, rendering this as a child lets us give comic some actual props. Whereas I can't do that here. Previously, we would have to use render props, which is very bad, very annoying. Don't have to do that anymore, thanks to context. But I'm not going to do that here. I'm going to use something that I feel like is woefully underrepresented when beginners are exposed to React Router, partially because it's complicated, and so a lot of people gloss over it, but partially because people don't like reading docs. But I trust all of you. I trust all of you read the docs, right? Because you're good people. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to these docs. we're going to see this sentence that so many people skip, which is that any valid URL or array of paths that path to regex understands. And this is actually a library that React Router depends on. And what this third word here stands for, regular expression, is a syntax that we use to describe the structure of text. If you've never seen a regular expression before, I highly recommend checking them out. They're super powerful, super fun, very confusing. I'm sure I'll do a video on regular expressions in the future because I'm a big fan. But basically it gives us this little syntax to describe text. And it can do lots of very powerful, confusing things. When you scroll into this GitHub repo, right, there's a lot of stuff going on. The important thing is right here, right? In regular expressions, we have operators, which are special characters that tell us how parts of our string are expected to behave. One of them is a question mark. It makes whatever comes before it optional. So this path right here, /:foo, /:bar, question mark, this will match /:foo, and then maybe something after it, right? Doesn't have to be there. And Blake has linked to regex1, which is a wonderful website for learning regular expressions via exercises, which is a much better way to do this than actually trying to learn it academically. So that's all we really need here, is to say, you know what, comic number is optional. It can be there, doesn't have to be, right? Don't need it. We're still going to match this route. And so now when I click on latest, right, we try to render our comic, but we immediately kind of error out. And that's because if we go ahead and look at our comic props, inside of props.match.params.comic_number, its value is undefined, right? Because it's not there. Notice it's still in params, right? We're still trying to match this slug, this URL parameter, but we just can't. It doesn't have a value. So how can we account for this? How can we account for the fact that comic number, thanks to this question mark, will sometimes be undefined? Well, I can use some trickery inside of my use effect, right? What this is saying is whenever a comic number changes, fetch the comic with that number. Well, I'm getting an error here because comic number is undefined. So I can add an if statement and say, if comic number is undefined, then what I actually want to do is I want to fetch the latest comic, right? Otherwise, I want to come here and I want to fetch the comic of the actual number that we have, right? So now that works, and I can go to the previous one. I can go to the latest one. It's all good. Any questions with that? All right, cool. Those are super powerful. Definitely look into that regular expression library that's get used, because you can match all kinds of cool, complicated things in your URLs. That's very, very neat, very powerful. Okay, so I've got that going. I have some issues here, right? When we go to the first things, the first comic, we're able to disable both of these buttons just fine. A little bit more difficult to do here. We can account for the fact that comic number is undefined. And again, I could pass this via props. And again, I'm going to be lazy. So I'm going to get params with my use params hook, which is just going to give me the parameters from whatever hook is above me. And so I will be able to get comic number out of here, which I'm just going to do directly via destructuring, because this is a very powerful way of doing this, and you'll see this a lot. And I can say, for these two later buttons, let's disable them on loading or when comic number is undefined, or just not comic number is another way of saying that, or not comic number, right? And that gives me a decent way of making sure those are disabled on the latest comic. We still have an issue though, which is when I go to a previous comic and I go to the next one, and then I go to the next one, I get a 404 because we're past the latest comic. Really, this is a failure of the API. Again, it should be telling us what the next and previous comics are. That shouldn't really be our job to calculate, but I wanted to work with an API that's actually a bit awkward here because that's real life. You're constantly going to be working with APIs that are not ideal, and you're going to have to work around them. Hopefully, wherever you do work, you have the power to change them or get someone to change them, but sometimes we have to make do. So, what we can do here is we can just use a trick. And we can say, you know what, if we get an error, and if its status code is 404, why don't we actually just take you back to the most recent comic? Right? Why don't we do that? And that's not perfect, but it's good enough for a portfolio piece, right? Just so someone doesn't accidentally do that and break it and be like, ugh, they don't know what they're doing. Yeah, thank you for coming by. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the if statement that I have here that shows up when our comic request fails. So if we have an error, I return this div that has the error message in it. What I want to do is I want to detect if that error was a 404. And the way I do this is the error object that we get from Axios actually has a key called response. And what's the value of this? Well, it's just the response. The exact same object I would have gotten if this had had a status code 200. Same deal. And I want to check, see, just make sure we don't get, an error.response is undefined error. If error.response is defined, and error.response.status, which is going to give us the status code of the response. If that's 404, then what I'm going to do is I want to change where we are to the most recent comic. And some of you might be thinking, oh, let me history.push there. But I can't do that outside of a use effect, right? That might put me into like a permanent loop of pain. So I'm not going to do that. All right, instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to render a special component that React Router DOM gives me called redirect. And redirect is a component that if it ever gets rendered, it just goes ahead and redirects you. So I want to redirect to slash. To equals slash. Right? And we'll just add another check in here. So if slash 404 is right, we don't keep ending up in an endless cycle. So I'm going to say and props dot, or we can just use comic number actually, and comic number, right, is not equal to undefined. We could have just said comic number, but that too. So now if we 404, that's just going to go ahead and redirect us to the latest comic. So that way, someone goes back and forward, they end up kind of where they're supposed to be. So, weird reality of our API, but good excuse to tell you about redirect. So, any questions there? Neat. Okay. Well, the last thing I really have prepared for you all is getting the random button to work, because this actually gets more difficult doing it this way, again, because of our API, but we can figure it out. But before we do that, is there anything that you all would like to see with React Router that perhaps you've heard about but you haven't had a chance to explore yet? All right, I take your silence as the fact that I've done an excellent job. Okay, so let's get our random button back, right? And what I'm going to do here is there's a million ways to do this. But what I'm going to have this random button do is I'm just going to have this not break the mold here. What this is going to do is this is going to do a history.push to another route. We'll just call this /random. Right? And what we need to do is handle this. Because if I click on this, right, comic num is going to be random, and it's going to 404, and now it's just going to take us back to the most recent comic. And the way we handle these special cases is inside of our use effect. So right now we're handling the special case of comic number being undefined. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add an else if comic number is random. And in this case, we're going to do something else. And I could write this as another function. I'm just going to do it all in line because I'm feeling lazy. What I'm going to do is I'm going to fetch the latest comic so that I have access to the number of the latest comic. And then I'm going to calculate a random number between that and 1. And then I'm going to history.push us there, right? I'm going to redirect us there. A pretty neat solution. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to request our latest comic here. And then I'm going to get the response. I'm going to get the number of our latest, comic, which is going to be response.data.num, right? Response.data is normally what we've been calling comic, and comic.num is the number of the comic, so response.data.num. Then I'm going to calculate a random value using the random number generator that you can find on MDN. It's just a quick little algorithm. It's math.floor of math.random, which gives us a random number between 0 and 1 inclusive, times latest minus 1, which gives us a random integer now between 0 and latest minus 1, plus 1, which now gives us a random integer between 1 and our latest comic value. And now that we have this, instead of trying to make this request, like now go and request that comic, right, and it gets all the more complicated, I'm just going to redirect us to where that is, right? I'm going to do prompts.history.push, and I'm just going to take us to where that comic lives, right? /random. But the actual value now of the variable random. So what should happen here is I click on random. It's going to show up in our URL for a second, and then it's going to redirect me away to a new random comic. Right? So we saw random for a second, and now we're on comic 1522. And this is pretty cool. Right? There's a problem here, which is what happens when I hit the back button. When I hit the back button, it takes us back to where we were previously, which is random, right? And then our use effect's going to fire, which is going to take us to a new random comic. So I can't actually go back to the previous comic. And I could try to be clever and jam on the back button a couple times, but you just saw what happened, right? A weird thing, which is we went to random and then we went back past it. But by going to random, we actually already fired this network request, which when it finishes is going to take us somewhere else anyway. And that's called a race condition. When we have, code that can finish in different orders and give us different results, those are actually hard to handle and kind of out of scope of what we're doing today. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it so that when you hit back, you don't go back to /random. And it's very simple. instead of using history.push, which is going to add a new entry onto the end of our list of history, we can use history.replace, which does what it says on the tin. It's just going to replace where we currently are and not add a new entry to history. So now I'm on comic 415, right? I hit random. We see random in the URL bar for a second, but then it redirects us to 721. When I hit back, we go to 415. We have erased random from our history and replaced it with that new value. So now random kind of works more like expected. And there's still technically a race condition there, but we'll fix that another time. All right. Any questions with that random button? All right. Well, I am done with my water, and I'm done with this project. So unless there's any lingering questions or stuff you'd like to talk about, I think we'll call it here. All right. Well, thank you all so much for stopping by.